very much for meeting with us.
Sure. When I think about the internet, I think, I think of sort of a series of trade-offs. On the one hand, you want the internet to be free. You want it to be a vibrant tool for people to communicate freely around the world. That's really its beauty, just instant communications, and that's wonderful, right? I mean, we're already seeing regimes like the Chinese regime and others sort of having to struggle with this incredible tool for cooperation. On the other hand, there are legitimate cybersecurity issues, whether it's terrorist networks using the internet, or frankly, whether it's our own networks, more broadly speaking, being vulnerable. And so there's a little bit of a tension there between wanting to keep regulation and the government out of it, but also recognizing that it's something that requires protection. And of course, one of the wonderful things about the internet, of course, is just its sheer vibrancy, and that everything is possible. In some tension with that, of course, is the need to protect intellectual property. I mean, we won't, if in some distant future we're in a world where there is no value attached to a novel or to a poem or to a movie or to music. I mean, guess what? People aren't going to make music and movies anymore. So there's a series of tensions that need to be carefully balanced. And I think it can be done. It's technically complicated. I think it can be done. Right. It's just something that requires a lot of attention.
Right. So speaking of intellectual property, do you think that in the wake of SOPA and PIPA, do you think that this new conversation is opening the opportunity to re-examine the U.S. copyright system?
So I'm not an expert in the copyright system, so I tend to sort of fall back on key principles. I was not a supporter of SOPA PIPA for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was that it sort of, in some ways, deputized network companies and others to either raise their hands and say, hey, we think there may be a national security violation here, or to be a little aggressive around people who they suspected were not treating intellectual property right. Look, to my way of thinking, there's probably a lot of analogies with copyright law. If you violate it, I mean, if you illegally download movies, that's a problem for you. And I think you're the person, whether you're an institution or an individual, against which the authorities need to seek redress, right? Not against the network companies who can't possibly monitor all the traffic on there. And I think on the security side too, look, just as the police need a warrant to knock on your door or to step onto your property, in a dangerous world, you need the authorities to have the ability to go in and look at somebody's email or to go in and look at somebody's traffic or whatnot, but they need to do so with a lot of oversight, meaning they actually need to go to the judiciary or to somebody and say, hey, here's my case, I need you to give me a warrant. So I think these things are things that we need to debate. And of course the internet is faster, it's bigger, it's a lot less controllable than handing around pieces of dead trees, right? But I think that the analogies to the way we've always thought about this stuff are a good starting point. I have no problem with the sort of privileged group of people who build the networks, who lay the fiber optic cable, who buy the servers, who actually construct the internet. They obviously need a return on their investment. Absolutely. If you're not paying people to make that kind of investment, they won't make that investment. However, and here's where this is really important, they then can also, I think, step in and think in terms of anything other than being a common carrier. They can't say, well, I don't much like your business, so we're going to treat you differently than my business. And by the way, I mean, if you're sort of historically attuned, again, there are historical models for this. I mean, in the late 1800s, one of the ways that the robber barons sort of tied up the economy was because they owned the railroads, and they would charge differentiated rates depending on whose stuff they were carrying. If they were carrying my fellow steel baron stuff, they'd get a discount. If they weren't, they weren't. That obviously doesn't work. That kills a competitive market. It kills innovation. So even though we're talking about technology that is changing every single day, there's still some basic principles looking back to the way the railroads were run in this country 100 years ago that I think we need to be mindful of. Because yes, we can't. At some level, as much as we say that the companies that build the backbone and the infrastructure of the internet, they absolutely deserve to get paid for doing so. So when somebody comes at me and says, hey, I want to charge you a little bit more to download 3 gigabits than to download 3 kilobytes, okay, that's a fair discussion. But when you start getting into differentiating kinds of content, particularly when those backbone companies sometimes own content companies, I start to get pretty nervous.
Around the blogosphere and all of that, for folks that are in support of net neutrality, they have there's an overwhelming sense that a lot of the politicians in the Congress and in the Senate really don't understand the nature of the internet or the concept of the internet. There's a
The
lot
tubes?
of exactly, yeah, a series of tubes. So I just wanted to see if you could comment just either in the House or in any other context. What is your sense, particularly when you're discussing this with your opposition in terms of net neutrality, SOPA, PIPA? What is your sense of what they understand about the whole concept of the internet and its purpose in our society?
Well, I think there's probably a generational divide. You've got, in the House and the Senate, you've got people ranging from their mid-30s to probably their mid-80s or a whole older. And, it won't come as a surprise that people who are, I don't want to draw an arbitrary line here, and of course there's exceptions to every rule, but people who are in their, 60s and above are probably, they didn't grow up with the internet. They may have had a staff for a very long time, so they haven't had to deal personally with emails. So there's certainly a big generational divide. And you've got high-tech internet entrepreneurs like Jared Polis of Colorado and others who are very, very knowledgeable on it. I happen to have been a tech banker back in '99 when everybody was a tech banker.
Right.
And so you've got that division. But then you've also got, I think, the same kinds of tensions that you have around other issues. I mean, there are going to be, let's just for sake of drawing a cartoon, there's going to be some national security hardcore conservative types who are going to say, maybe I'm willing to encroach on privacy and individual liberty in favor of catching those terrorists or however they want to frame it. So those tensions will continue to exist. But I really do think it's it's essential that people understand that the internet, and look, all you got to do is look at the market caps of companies like Google and Facebook and whatnot to understand that it's not something to be taken lightly. I mean, this is as important to the future of this country as the highway system, as the railroad system, as the electrical power, as we all saw during the hurricane. It's that essential to our prosperity and to our security that we get that right.
What's going to be the greatest challenge, if you can answer that?
Yeah, well, let me answer that very generally, and then let's go back to kind of how we think about the more online world and internet as a specific topic. Look, generally, for the last 12, 13, 14, even longer than that, the country's been living beyond its means. We sort of had it all, right? We had low taxes and two wars that we apparently wanted to fight, and a fairly robust Medicare and Social Security system, and this and that. We've reached the point now where the trade-offs have come home to roost, and we need to do some difficult thinking. All too often it becomes a fight between the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans, whatever. What's interesting about that, what's most interesting to me is, yes, we should debate whether we're paying, whether we're government is 17% of GDP or 21% of GDP. But what's really interesting, and this is probably a good transition point into internet and networks and whatnot, is where are there opportunities for win-wins? The Medicare. The healthcare system is absolutely archaic and inefficient. Guess what? The Pentagon is also, inefficient in some pretty staggering ways. And if you can find ways of creatively and innovatively addressing those institutions, which, by the way, is very, very difficult, you can just make for a more efficient, better, more end-oriented government, which I think is key. So that's going to be very much, front and center here. With respect to the future, you asked sort of about the future of the economy too. I do worry quite a bit about, inequality in our society. The fact is that we're a much more unequal country today than we were 50 years ago. And that's for good reasons and bad reasons. It's good reasons include the fact that the real world-beating American industries today are industries that require engineering skills, that require a lot of education, and that's a good thing. I mean, this is the future of our economy in many ways. But it's also a scary thing and a bad thing in as much as it leaves a lot of people behind, which kind of gets me to the digital divide question. I mean, I remember when eBay first came out, right? When eBay first came out, all of a sudden, Americans' wealth, whether they knew it or not, went way up because all of that crap that you had in the attic or in the basement now is actually worth something. And so that sort of can potentially transform, a household's life because all that stuff in your attic, somebody wants to buy it. You have a really efficient market. By the same token, there's a million stories out there of people creating apps or doing this or doing that and, actually making a living doing it. But you can only do that if you're A, educated enough to operate in that environment, and B, obviously in a world where you're wired, where you've got bandwidth and where you've got the money to buy the equipment. So the larger inequality paradigm that I think we need to think about in this country is reflected too, and in some ways turbocharged, if you will, by the power of networks, which if you can use them and you can get in there, it can change your life for the better. If you can't, you're going to get left even more behind.
Right. Okay. Well, Congressman Himes,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, anytime.